The strategic detail in this story that stopped me mid-read was the vinyl. One record, sold for maybe $40 in a bulk lot, quietly transferred away to fund someone else's security deposit. In his second life, that same pressing carries a $75,000 appraisal. You're watching Historical Manhwa. The smell of old vinyl is specific. It is not the smell of plastic or dust alone. It is something older than both, a compound of pressed lacquer and paper sleeves and decades of careful handling, faintly chemical, faintly sweet, like the inside of a library that has never been renovated. Ethan Cole had grown up with that smell the way other children grew up with the smell of their mother's perfume. It was the smell of Saturday mornings on the floor of his grandfather's study. It was the smell of being 10 years old and being handed something irreplaceable and being told quietly that he was trusted with it. He was 26 years old when he carried the last crate out to the car. The morning was gray. Not the romantic kind of gray that photographers chase, not the moody overcast of a film scene. Just flat, January gray, the color of cheap sidewalk concrete, the kind of cold that gets into the gap between your collar and your jaw. His breath came out in small, even clouds. He set the crate on the trunk of his mother's sedan and adjusted his grip, and he did not look down at the records inside it because he had already made his decision. He had already told himself it was a practical choice. He had already built a version of this moment in his head that he could survive. That all of them? His mother, Margaret Cole, stood at the front door with a mug in both hands. She had the posture of someone watching movers work. She was not watching movers, but she was watching her son. "That's all of them?" Ethan said. "Good," she sipped. "Derek's bringing the van at 9:30. You'll need to be at the shop by 10 to make sure they weigh it all before close." The shop was Hayward's Used Media on Prescott Avenue. It was the kind of place with fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency just below conscious awareness, and a teenage employee who would assess a crate of 40 years of meticulously cataloged, sleeve-protected, lovingly sourced vinyl records and offer him, collectively, $212. He already knew that price. He had called ahead. He had asked if there was any way to get individual appraisals, because some of these records were rare pressings, some had significant collector value. Some needed to be priced individually rather than by the crate. The teenager on the phone had put him on hold for 4 minutes and then come back and said they could do individual assessment, but the wait time was 6 to 8 weeks. Diane needed the deposit by the end of the month. Diane. His stepsister, technically, though that word did not quite capture the architecture of what she was in his family. His mother's first marriage had produced Ethan. His mother's second marriage, to Richard Whitmore, a man whose entire personality was composed of deferred decisions and golf weekends, had produced Diane. Diane was 24. Diane had found an apartment in Riverside Heights that had exposed brick and a wine rack built into the kitchen island, and her deposit was $6,000, and she was $4,000 short. The math had been presented to Ethan in a family meeting that lasted 45 minutes and involved a printed spreadsheet. He had sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers, while his mother walked him through them, and he had understood, in a very clear and quiet way, that the meeting was not actually a discussion. The meeting was a notification. His vinyl collection had been assessed by his stepfather, Richard, who had looked things up on some secondary market website for approximately 11 minutes and determined that the total value was somewhere between $800 and $1,200. As the collection would be sold, the proceeds, combined with Diane's savings, would cover the shortfall. Ethan would be reimbursed, Richard had said, with the satisfied tone of a man who has just solved someone else's problem once Diane was established. Established. The word had sat in Ethan's chest like a swallowed coin. He had not argued. He had learned in 26 years of being Margaret Cole's son. That argument consumed energy and produced nothing but a more refined version of the original decision. His mother did not change her mind under pressure. She restated her position in smaller words. He had not cried either, because the habit of not crying in front of his family had been established so early in his life that it was less a choice and more a physiological fact. He had simply sat there and looked at the spreadsheet and said, "Okay." But the crates in the trunk represented 43 years of his grandfather's taste and 11 years of his own. His grandfather, James Cole, had started collecting in 1971, the year he came back from a long assignment overseas and needed something to anchor himself to. He had bought a turntable and 3 records, and slowly, over 4 decades, built something that was less a collection and more a personal archive. He had bought first pressings when he could find them. He had kept everything in paper sleeves, in crates, away from heat and direct light, because he had read a book about preservation in 1979 and taken it seriously in the way that his generation took useful information seriously, permanently. James Cole had died when Ethan was 15, and he had left the collection to Ethan specifically, named in a handwritten note attached to the crates, not in the formal will. Oh, the formal will had been contested by various relatives and had distributed a modest estate in ways that mostly satisfied no one. But the note had been clear, and his mother had honored it, and for 11 years Ethan had added to the collection the way his grandfather had taught him to, slowly, with attention, prioritizing condition and provenance over quantity. The collection numbered 217 records when Derek's van pulled up at 9:28. Derek Whitmore. Diane's boyfriend for the last 3 years, the architectural detail of a person that Ethan could never quite see clearly. Derek was 31 and worked in some capacity in commercial real estate leasing, which he discussed at every family dinner with the exhausting confidence of a man who mistakes familiarity with a subject for mastery of it. He had a jawline that photographed well, and an opinion about every restaurant. Oh, he drove a leased car and wore the kind of watch that was expensive enough to signal success, but not expensive enough to represent it. Ethan had never disliked anyone the way he disliked Derek, which was methodically and without drama, the way you dislike a persistent, low-grade headache. "Hey, man." Derek clapped him on the shoulder once, the way men clap people on the shoulder when they want the transaction of affection without the actual investment. "Appreciate you doing this." "Oh, really?" "Sure," Ethan said. "Diane is going to love that place. The neighborhood is coming up, too. You should see what they're doing with the waterfront." Derek was already lifting a crate, assessing its weight. "These real?" "They're vinyl records. Yes, they're real." "No, I mean, are any of them actually worth something? Or is it all just old stuff?" Ethan looked at him for a moment. He looked at the way Derek's hands were placed on the crate. No care for pressure points. Fingers over the record edges rather than the frame, the casual grip of a man handling storage boxes. He thought about the Blue Note first pressing sitting approximately 4 inches from Derek's left thumb. He thought about the 1963 original pressing in the paper sleeve at the bottom of the second crate, the one with the original capital label, the one his grandfather had found at an estate sale in 1988 and come home and called Ethan's father, who was still alive then, just to tell someone. No, Ethan said. "It's just old stuff." Hayward's used media gave him $230 because the teenager who did the appraisal found 4 records he liked personally and bumped the offer up slightly out of what appeared to be genuine, if minor, enthusiasm. Ethan stood at the counter and watched the crates go behind the partition, and he took the cash in an envelope and he drove home and he put the envelope on the kitchen table and he went to his room and he lay on his bed and he stared at the ceiling for 1 hour and 20 minutes, which he knew precisely because the digital clock on his desk was directly in his sightline. $230. 6 months later, Diane and Derek moved into the apartment in Riverside Heights. His mother threw a housewarming dinner. There was catered food and a cake with the address written on it in frosting, and everyone stood around the exposed brick in the kitchen with wine glasses, and Ethan stood in the corner near the window and looked out at the view of the parking structure across the street, and drank cheap Prosecco and said, "Thank you," when Diane hugged him and said she couldn't have done it without him. She had not been to his apartment since the move. He lived in a studio on the 3rd floor of a building on Merchant Street that had a parking lot in front and a bus stop directly outside his window that ran from 6 in the morning to 11 at night. His kitchen had a 2-burner stove and a window that faced a brick wall. He had been there for 4 years. He had been planning to move before the vinyl money went away. He had been saving, slowly, for a deposit somewhere better. He had not told his family this. Well, because it was his plan and he had learned to keep plans private. And then he had been sitting at a kitchen table looking at a spreadsheet, and the plan had dissolved without ceremony. He worked in data management for a mid-sized logistics company. The work was precise and largely invisible, the kind of labor that holds organizations together in the way that electrical wiring holds buildings together. essential, structural, and noticed only when it fails. He was good at it. He was meticulous and thorough, and he saw patterns in data that his colleagues missed. Not because he was particularly brilliant, but because he had the patience to look. His salary was $51,000 a year, which covered rent and food and his monthly contribution to a health savings account, and left him, at the end of each month, a modest remainder that he was gradually rebuilding into a deposit fund. He had one friend who knew what the vinyl collection had meant, Marcus Webb, a man who had known him since college, who collected records himself on a smaller scale, who had come over once in the first months after the sale and sat in the studio apartment with 2 beers and said, quietly, that what his family had done was a robbery. Not metaphorically. A robbery. And Ethan had agreed, in the same quiet tone, and they had finished their beers, and the subject had been set down, and that had been the entire acknowledgement the wound received. The next 3 years were not bad in any cinematic sense. There was no spiral, there was no dramatic collapse, there was just the slow, incremental accumulation of a life that was smaller than it should have been, the kind of diminishment that doesn't announce itself, but just becomes, over time, the shape of things. He moved up 1 grade at work, and his salary became $59,000. He rebuilt his savings to $11,000. He started looking at apartments in the same neighborhood as Diane's because it was walkable and the buildings were solid, and he had spent enough of his life with a bus stop outside his window. He found a 1-bedroom in a building 2 streets over. The deposit was $6,500. He was ready. His mother called him on a Tuesday. His stepfather, Richard, had made some investments. The investments had not performed. There was a shortfall in some account or another, some mechanism of the family's finances that had been quietly underperforming for years and had finally become impossible to ignore. She did not ask him directly, not at first. She framed it as information. She was just letting him know. The family was under some financial pressure. Richard's firm was restructuring. These things happened. He told his $11,000 goodbye before she reached the request. The request came, and he said yes. All because he was 30 years old and still operating inside the architecture of a family that had trained him to absorb costs without complaint. And because saying no had consequences that he did not have the energy to manage. And because some part of him still believed, against all available evidence, that the reimbursement would come. Not from the vinyl, necessarily. Not specifically. Just some general accounting. Some moment when the ledger was finally balanced. The money went. Now the apartment went. The bus stop remained. He found out about the Beatles record on a Wednesday night in November. 3 years after the sale, sitting in his studio apartment with his laptop and a bowl of instant noodles that he had been eating too much of lately because the grocery store on the corner had closed and the nearest replacement was 6 blocks away. And he was tired in the specific way of a person who has been making accommodations for too long. He was not looking for it. He was browsing a music forum, the kind of low-traffic, obsessively detailed corner of the internet where serious collectors discuss pressing variants and matrix etchings, and he saw a thread about a recent auction result. A 1966 Capitol Records pressing, first state, original label, the kind that had been recalled almost immediately after distribution due to the cover art. Almost all copies had been returned to the factory. A small number had escaped into the wild. The thread was discussing a recent sale of one such copy at a specialist auction house in London. Final hammer price, with buyer's premium $77,200. Ethan read the thread for 1 hour and 45 minutes. He went through the details with the focused attention of someone who already knows what they are looking for and is only now finding the words for it. He knew that pressing. He knew it specifically and personally, the way you know a face. His grandfather had found it at an estate sale in 1988. It had been in the second crate. It had been approximately 4 inches from Derek Whitmore's left thumb. He sat very still in his studio apartment for a long time. The bus outside ran until 11 and then went quiet, and still he sat there, and the noodles went cold, and the laptop screen dimmed and then went dark. And he sat in the dark with what he now knew. $230. Total. For the entire collection. And for your one record, $77,000. He got up at 1 in the morning and made instant coffee because it was the only thing he had that tasted like something. And he stood at his kitchen window and looked at the brick wall. And he felt, for the first time in 3 years, something that was neither grief nor resignation. It was colder than both. It was specific and directionless at once, the way hunger is specific and directionless, and he recognized it after a moment as the feeling of a person who has just understood, fully, the exact dimensions of what was taken from them. He did not sleep that night. He did not sleep the night after either. And on the third night, he took a sleeping pill that he had been prescribed for a brief period the previous year and never finished. And he slept, and he did not dream. And in the morning, he was simply tired and still knew what he knew. He started researching. Not because he had a plan, not yet, but because the data was there and he was someone who processed data, and the alternative was to simply sit with the number, and he could not do that. He found the record in the Hayward's used media online inventory listed at $65 as a vintage Capital LP original pressing, somewhere to sleeve. He spent 4 nights reading about the record's history, its variants, its distinguishing features. He used the matrix code that would confirm a first state pressing versus a later one. He read auction results going back 15 years. He mapped the price trajectory. In 2008, a confirmed first state copy had sold at auction for $22,000. By 2015, comparable copies were clearing $40,000. By 2022, the London auction. The trajectory was not complicated. This was a known quantity to serious collectors. This was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. Chinos, the teenager at Hayward's, had not been paying attention. The teenager at Hayward's had been paying approximately $45 worth of attention, which was what that record had been assigned in the bulk lot. On the 5th day of his research, he called Hayward's used media. The record was gone. Sold 3 years ago, 6 weeks after his collection came in. Online sale. Buyer's address, North Carolina. The teenager, who turned out to be named Brendan and was now 22 and had developed more expertise in the intervening 3 years, did not remember the specific sale, but pulled the records and confirmed it. He also noted, with the careful tone of someone delivering unpleasant information, that based on the description and the matrix code noted in their system from the intake assessment, yes, it had likely been a first state pressing. "Do you know what they paid for it?" Ethan asked. Brendan was quiet for a moment. "I shouldn't really share customer transaction details." "Roughly, a range." Another pause. $210. Ethan thanked him and hung up and sat at his desk and looked at the wall, and the number echoed inside him the way sound echoes in an empty room. $210. He went to work the next day. He sat at his desk and performed his work with his usual precision, and his colleagues noticed nothing different about him because there was nothing visibly different about him. He had the look of a person who had been very still for a very long time and was still being very still. He processed the data that needed processing. He attended the 11 o'clock meeting. He ate a sandwich at his desk. At 2:47 in the afternoon, he had a cardiac event. He was 33 years old, and he had no prior history and no risk factors except the ones that accumulate quietly in a person who has been under low-grade chronic stress for years, who eats too much sodium because the food available to him is convenient rather than good, who does not sleep properly and does not exercise because there is a particular kind of exhaustion that makes effort feel like additional cost rather than investment. The event was significant enough that he was unconscious by the time the ambulance arrived and did not regain consciousness in the hospital. He was dead by 5 o'clock. He woke up on a Tuesday morning in January, and the first thing he smelled was vinyl. He was lying in his childhood bedroom, in the narrow bed with the blue coverlet, and through the window the winter sky was the flat concrete gray of an early morning. And somewhere in the house he could hear his mother's coffee maker going through its cycle, that specific sequence of gurgles and hisses that he had heard every morning for the first 18 years of his life. The familiar smell was coming from the corner of the room, where his grandfather's crates were stacked, all 4 of them, waiting. He did not move for a long time. He lay very still, and he breathed the smell of the vinyl, and he processed what was in front of him with the same methodical attention he brought to data, because he was not yet fully convinced that this was not a dream or a hallucination or some variety of dying brain experience. And he did not want to move precipitously. He was aware of the specific tension of the sheets against his arms. He was aware of the sound of the bus on the street outside. which was different from the bus on Merchant Street, a different route, different interval, and he knew that difference. He was aware of the complete absence of the ache in his lower back that had become, in his final years, essentially constant. He was 22 years old. He sat up slowly and looked at his hands, the hands of a 22-year-old, which were the same as his hands had always been, but lighter in some way he couldn't immediately articulate. Less worn. Oh, the specific wear of years of small physical labors not yet accumulated. He got out of bed and stood on the floor and looked at the crates. 217 records. He crossed the room in 4 steps, and he crouched in front of the crates and he went through them. Not quickly, not with the urgent scrabbling of someone making sure of a thing, but slowly and carefully, the way his grandfather had taught him to go through a crate, from the front, by lifting records one at a time to check their condition. The records were all there, every single one, in the order he had arranged them, every sleeve intact, every paper inner sleeve present, every sleeve note and insert, and occasionally a handwritten index card from his grandfather, noting where and when and for how much. He found the capital pressing at the bottom of the second crate. He held it by the edges, his thumbs on the paper of the inner sleeve. The outer sleeve was intact. No seam splits, the original coating still holding its sheen in the way early pressings held their sheen when they'd been kept properly. He could read the matrix code at the inner groove without removing the record from the sleeve, because his grandfather had taught him to memorize matrix codes the way other people memorize phone numbers, as distinguishing features of something worth knowing. This was a first state. This was sitting in a crate in his childhood bedroom, on a first state copy of a record that would, in 11 years, sell at auction in London for $77,000. In current dollars, at current market, it was probably worth close to $40,000. In 11 years, it would be worth more. He knew the trajectory. He had memorized it. He put the record back in the second crate and replaced it carefully, the way you replace something you intend to keep. Then he sat on his bed and he thought. He had 11 years to work with. He had the full contents of a mind that had spent an extra 11 years doing data analysis and watching patterns and reading, in his last year of life, everything he could find about asset valuation and secondary market economics for collectibles, because he had been trying to understand, with the obsessive focus of a person trying to retrospectively comprehend a loss, exactly what had been taken from him. He had not planned to use that knowledge. He had been simply building it. Oh, the way a person in pain sometimes converts pain into information, because information is the one thing pain cannot take away. But he was, by 22 years old, and it was January, and his mother had not yet called a family meeting. He had approximately 3 weeks. He knew the date of the family meeting precisely. He had a very good memory, always had, and the date of the meeting had been January 22nd, a Tuesday, because he had written it in his planner as family dinner, and later, almost after everything, he had sometimes found himself looking at that notation and thinking about how much information that neutral phrase had concealed. Today was January 4th. He had 18 days. The question of what to do with 18 days was not complicated. The question was only whether he was willing to do it properly. He showered and dressed and came downstairs at 7:15, which was his usual time in this house, and he sat at the kitchen table while his mother poured coffee. Thus, and he watched her the way he had been watching her for 22 years, but had never fully understood. The slightly impatient efficiency of her movements, the way she organized a kitchen, the way she organized everything, function over warmth, everything in its place, and its place assigned without consultation. She was 51 years old in this version of the morning. She was wearing a gray cardigan that he remembered. She set his coffee in front of him and said good morning. Morning, Ethan said. I need to talk to you about something. She sat down across from him with her own mug. What? I'm thinking about making some changes to how I have the collection stored. I want to document everything properly. Insurance purposes. His mother looked at him with the expression of a woman receiving information of no particular interest to her. Okay. I'm going to have some of the records individually appraised, and the ones that might have significant collector value. That sounds like a lot of effort. Some of them could be worth a meaningful amount. Grandpa's eye was good. He kept his tone neutral, the tone of someone discussing a practical matter. I found a shop in the city that does authentication and appraisal for vintage records. I'm going to take a few of the more promising ones in. His mother sipped her coffee. You're not going to sell them? It was not a question. It was a warning wearing the shape of a sentence, and Ethan recognized the shape exactly, the slightly tightened quality of her voice that preceded the deployment of the family position. "I haven't decided anything yet," Ethan said. "I'm documenting." She looked at him for a moment with the assessing quality she brought to all information, deciding where it fit in her internal organization of the world. Then she said, "Okay," in the tone that meant the conversation was over. Annan picked up her phone from beside her mug, and Ethan looked down at his coffee and thought, 3 weeks is plenty of time. The appraisal shop was called Criterion Audio on East Talbot Street, on the second floor of a building that had once been a printing house and still smelled faintly of something industrial, sweet, and metallic at once. Ethan had found it by searching online the previous night, an hour after everyone was asleep, using his phone under his covers with the specific furtiveness of a person doing something they do not want observed. Not because it was wrong, but because he had learned, very early, the importance of maintaining information asymmetry in this household. What they did not know he was doing, they could not weigh in on, redirect, or appropriate. The shop was run by a man named Gordon Fitch, who was 63 years old and had the precise, weathered look of someone who has spent decades in a field that rewards patience over speed. His shop was clean in the way that organized minds are clean, not empty, but ordered, everything assigned to logic. He had 3 employees, 2 young men who did intake and cataloging, and a woman in her 50s who did authentication for disputed pieces. Ethan had brought 3 records with him. He had brought the capital pressing, which he had wrapped in a clean cotton cloth and then in tissue paper, and then placed in a padded interior pocket of his bag, the way you carry something that you do not want to exist in the same physical space as risk. He had also brought 2 other records from the collection that he was reasonably confident had significant value, to both Blue Note pressings from the early 60s that his grandfather had acquired in the late 70s, at a time when those records were undervalued, and his grandfather, who had good ears and better instincts, had recognized them for what they were. He sat across from Gordon Fitch and laid the 3 records on the cotton pad on the desk between them and watched Gordon's face. Gordon was quiet for a long time. He lifted each record carefully, read the matrix codes, looked at the label. He looked at the sleeve. He did not speak until he had examined all 3, and then he set them down in a row on the cotton pad and looked at Ethan with the expression of someone deciding how much to say. Where did these come from? My grandfather's collection. He started collecting in 1971. Gordon nodded slowly. He had a good eye. Yes, these 2, Gordon indicated the Blue Note pressings, are original Van Gelder pressings. The condition on both is excellent. Well, I'd want to do a full play grade to confirm, but visually, these are probably worth $6,000 to $8,000 each in the current market. He paused. Could be more in a specialty auction context. Ethan kept his face neutral. And the 3rd one. Gordon looked at the capital pressing for a moment, as if deciding something. Then he said, I need to examine the matrix more carefully. Do you have time to wait? He waited for 40 minutes. During which Gordon disappeared into a back room, and Ethan sat in one of the shop's 2 visitor chairs and read a trade publication about vintage audio equipment without retaining a single word of it. His hands were completely still. His breathing was even. He had the composed exterior of a person feeling nothing, because feeling something required energy, and he needed his energy for calculation. Gordon came back and sat down and placed the capital pressing on the cotton pad between them. "Oh, this is a first state pressing," Gordon said. "Confirmed. The matrix indicates original production, pre-recall. The sleeve condition is extraordinary for a copy of this age. I've seen 2 other confirmed first state copies in this condition in my career." He paused again. "I sold one of them in 2019 for $34,000. The London market has moved significantly since then. What would you estimate the current value at?" Ethan said. Gordon looked at him with the careful expression of a man who is about to say a number and knows what that number will feel like to the person receiving it. For a private sale, conservatively, $40,000 to $45,000. At a properly marketed specialist auction with the right bidder pool, potentially more, possibly significantly more depending on the timing and the buyer. Ethan looked at the record on the cotton pad. He looked at the familiar label, the paper sleeve he had memorized. The outer cover with its original coding. "What would the documentation process look like for authentication purposes?" he said. if I wanted to have a formal certificate of authenticity produced. Gordon explained the process. Ethan asked questions. He asked them in the precise, unhurried manner of a person building a file, not performing interest, but actually constructing a record, a chain of documentation that would make the record's identity and its value facts rather than claims. He took notes on his phone. He confirmed Gordon's rates and timeline. He thanked Gordon and shook his hand and carefully rewrapped the 3 records and returned them to his bag. He walked out onto East Talbot Street and stood on the sidewalk in the cold air, and he allowed himself, for approximately 15 seconds, to feel the specific sensation of knowing exactly what he was going to do. Then he started doing it. The first step was documentation. He had 18 days before his mother's family meeting, and he needed the collection to be on record as belonging to him specifically and as having demonstrable monetary value before that meeting could take place. His grandfather's handwritten note existed, and it had once felt like enough, but Ethan was older now in the way that mattered. He understood that informal documentation was only as strong as the willingness of the people involved to honor it. And he was no longer willing to assume the willingness of anyone in his family to honor anything that cost them. He had learned about small estate documentation the hard way through the years after the sale, through conversations with Marcus Webb's older sister, who was a paralegal, and who had, over a long dinner when he was 27, explained to him precisely the mechanisms by which informal transfers of personal property could be challenged, reversed, or simply ignored. He had no money then to do anything with that information. He was 22 years old now and also had no money, but money was not the bottleneck. The bottleneck was time, and he had 18 days, and he knew exactly which parts of the legal framework were accessible without significant cost. He went to the public library, which had a free legal resources center on the 2nd floor, staffed on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons by a rotating roster of pro bono attorneys through the City Bar Association. He went on Thursday. The attorney assigned to him that afternoon was a woman named Patricia Oseye, who was 40-something and had the efficient, compassionate manner of someone who has spent years helping people who should have gotten legal advice years earlier. He explained his situation concisely. He had inherited a personal property collection through an informal written bequest. The collection had significant monetary value. He wanted to document the inheritance properly. She walked him through the process. In their state, personal property bequeathed through informal written instruments was legally valid for items that were not otherwise covered under a formal will, provided the instrument clearly identified the property and the beneficiary, still was signed by the decedent, and could be corroborated if challenged. His grandfather's note met the first 2 criteria. The corroboration question was the more interesting one. "Do you have any witnesses who can attest to your grandfather's intent?" Patricia asked. "My grandfather talked about this with several people over the years. My father, before he died, a neighbor named Edmund Briggs, who used to come over to listen to records and is still alive. I knew a woman named Catherine Hall, who was in my grandfather's book club and had coffee with him regularly, and who he discussed the collection with specifically." Patricia nodded, making notes. "Those are useful. They're not legally binding in themselves, but they create a corroborating record. The most important thing you can do right now is get the property formally documented. That means a detailed inventory, condition assessment, and ideally a professional appraisal." He had the appraisal, or the beginning of one. He would have the formal authentication certificate from Gordon Fitch within 2 weeks. He had paid the deposit from his savings. He went home that Thursday evening, and he sat at his desk in his childhood bedroom and he started the inventory. He had learned, in his previous life, to build data structures that were comprehensive and navigable. And he built one now, a spreadsheet on his laptop that listed every record in the collection by artist, album title, label, our catalog number, pressing date, pressing country, condition grade, and known provenance, where applicable. For each of the 3 records he had taken to Gordon Fitch, he noted the preliminary appraisal. For the rest of the collection, he used the secondary market research he had conducted over a year of nighttime reading in his studio apartment, cross-referencing auction results and dealer inventories to assign reasonable market value estimates. The total came to somewhere between $92,000 and $120,000. He had known the collection was valuable. He had always known it was valuable in the way that you know the value of something you love, which is a composite knowledge. part financial and part personal, and therefore somewhat imprecise. He had not known it was this valuable. His grandfather's eye had been better than he had fully understood. The cumulative value of 4 decades of careful, attentive collecting, preserved in good condition through decades of consistent care, was not a number that Richard Whitmore's 11 minutes of secondary market browsing had come close to capturing. He looked at the number on his screen for a long time. Then he called Marcus Webb. Marcus lived 20 minutes away, in the apartment he had moved into after graduation, a second-floor place above a dry cleaner on Hendricks Avenue. He answered on the second ring. "You okay?" Marcus said. Because Ethan calling in the evening was not the pattern, and Marcus had always been attentive to pattern. "I'm fine. I need your help with something. Can I come over?" He took the bus, 20 minutes, and sat in Marcus's kitchen while Marcus made tea. The specific domestic comfort of Marcus's kitchen, which smelled of cardamom and dish soap, and had a collection of concert posters on the wall that Marcus had been building since they were 18. He explained what he needed. Not all of it. Not the full shape of what he was preparing for, but enough. He needed a witness statement confirming what Marcus knew about the collection's inheritance, about conversations Ethan had had with his grandfather about the collection, about the history of how it had come to him. "That's easy," Marcus said. "James talked about that collection like it was a living thing. He used to call it the archive, remember? He never called it a collection." "I remember. He told me once in your kitchen, when you were in the other room, that the only thing he was certain of was that you'd keep it properly. He used that word, properly." Marcus wrapped his hands around his mug. "What's this for, exactly?" Ethan looked at the concert posters on the wall. "Insurance," he said. Marcus looked at him for a moment with the particular quality of attention that close, long-term friendship produces in a person, the ability to read what is not being said without requiring it to be said. "Okay," he said. Who do I give the statement to?" The week before the family meeting, the authentication certificate came from Gordon Fitch. It confirmed the capital pressing as a first state copy in excellent to near mint condition with an estimated current market value of $42,000. The certificate included a detailed physical description of the record, its distinguishing characteristics, matrix codes, and the basis for the valuation. It was signed and notarized. Ethan had it copied 4 times. He kept 1 copy in his room, put 1 in a sealed envelope at Marcus's apartment, put 1 in a safe deposit box that he had opened the previous week at the credit union 3 streets from his childhood home for an annual fee of $25, and put the final copy, along with the full inventory and the witness statements from Marcus Webb, Edmund Briggs, and a brief written note from Catherine Hall, whom he had tracked down through his grandfather's address book, into a manila folder that he kept in his bag at all times. He also called Patricia Osei again and had a second consultation about the specific question of what happened to personal property that had been transferred through an informal written bequest when a family member attempted to sell that property without the beneficiary's consent. Patricia had been direct. And if the property was documented, the bequest was legally valid, and any sale conducted without the beneficiary's explicit written consent would constitute conversion of personal property. Civil theft, with potential for both damages and recovery of the property's fair market value. The documentation was the lever. Without it, the matter would have been difficult to litigate. With it, anyone attempting to appropriate the collection would be creating a financial liability for themselves. He had not decided yet whether he would use this lever. He had built it because he was no longer the 22-year-old who had said okay at a kitchen table and carried crates to a car. He was, in the most literal sense, someone who knew how this ended. And knowing how it ended meant that every prior step had a different quality to it. Not fate, but avoidable mechanism, a chain of events that only repeated if he permitted it to. The family meeting was on a Tuesday as expected. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the spreadsheet that his stepfather Richard laid out on the table. Diane's income, her savings, the apartment deposit, the shortfall. He watched his mother's hands around her coffee mug. He watched Derek, who was apparently now attending family financial meetings, who had brought a folder of his own with printouts about the apartment's projected appreciation value, because Derek had the habit of framing everything he wanted as an investment thesis. The collection could cover the gap and then some. Richard said, gesturing at his own notes. "I've looked at what these things sell for, and—" "No," Ethan said. Silence. His mother looked at him. Richard looked at him. Diane, who was sitting across from him with the slightly uncomfortable expression of someone who has been told the negotiation is already done and doesn't entirely want to watch the confirmation process, looked at him. Derek, who was beside Diane, it had the expression of a man whose investment thesis has encountered an unexpected variable. "The collection isn't for sale," Ethan said. He kept his voice at the same register it had been in all morning. Even, quiet, clear. The register of someone who has already finished calculating and is now simply reporting results. "It was left to me specifically by my grandfather. That bequest is documented. So the collection has recently been appraised at between $92,000 and $120,000 total, with individual items significantly above what any secondary market casual search would suggest." He took the manila folder from his bag and set it on the table. "The authentication certificate for one pressing alone values it at $42,000. I've had the full bequest documented with the county clerk's office, and I have witness statements corroborating the inheritance. If anyone attempts to sell any part of the collection without my explicit written consent, that constitutes conversion of personal property under civil law." He looked at his mother when he said that last part. Not at Richard, not at Derek. At his mother, because his mother was the decision-maker at this table, and always had been. Since she was the one who needed to understand that the architecture of this particular situation was different from the architecture she was accustomed to. She looked back at him with the measuring expression he had known his entire life. She did not say anything for a long moment. "You had the collection appraised," she said finally. "Last week. Gordon Fitch at Criterion Audio on East Talbot. 30 years in the business. His authentication certificate is in the folder." Another silence. Derek opened his mouth, and Richard made a small, specific movement that caused Derek to close it again, which was perhaps the most useful thing Richard had done in Ethan's memory. "I understand Diane needs the deposit," Ethan said. "I'm not dismissing that. I'm saying the solution to that problem is not the collection. The collection is mine. It was always mine." He stood up from the table. He picked up his bag. He left the folder on the table because they could look at it. Oh, they could take it to their own lawyer if they wanted, and what they would find was that the documentation was solid. He went upstairs to his room and sat on his bed and looked at the crates in the corner. He could hear their voices below, the specific quality of a family conversation being conducted in lower registers because the subject of it was upstairs. He could not make out words. He did not need to. He knew the shape of the conversation. His mother reorienting around the new information. I watched Richard adjusting, Derek objecting, and being managed by Diane, because Diane was not actually stupid, and had likely understood the moment the folder came out that the terrain had changed. He sat with the smell of vinyl around him, and he thought about the next steps. He did not intend to simply hold the collection and wait. That was not the play. The play was multi-stage, and it required patience. Oh, and he had something he had not had the first time through, a comprehensive understanding of exactly how the family's financial decisions were going to unfold over the next decade, which was to say, badly. Richard's investments were going to continue underperforming. The logistics firm where Ethan himself would spend his career was undergoing a quiet transformation that would, within 4 years, restructure the data management division and create significant lateral movement for people who had positioned themselves correctly. His mother's house, which she and Richard owned jointly, and which carried a mortgage that had been refinanced twice, was in a neighborhood that was about to be rezoned for mixed commercial development, which would affect property values in ways that Richard would mismanage, because Richard always mismanaged things that required sustained attention. He knew all of this the way you know a story you have read multiple times, not in its mechanical detail, all at once, but in its broad shape, its foreseeable arcs. He could not predict everything. He could not predict outcomes with actuarial precision. But he had the map of the last 11 years in his memory, and a map is not certainty, but it is an enormous advantage over traveling without one. He made a second appointment with Patricia Osei, this time to talk not about defense, but about construction, how to build an entity around an asset. She referred him because his questions had outgrown pro bono scope to a colleague named Samuel Adler, who did small business and estate work at a firm 2 miles from the library. Samuel Adler was 48, brisk and unsentimental, the kind of attorney who bills in 6-minute increments and considers this not mercenary but honest. And he charged $220 an hour, and Ethan paid for 3 hours of his time from his savings, and came out of those 3 hours with a structure. The collection would be placed into a single-member LLC, which he would form immediately. The LLC would own the collection as a business asset. The formation documents would describe the collection's function: acquisition, preservation, and eventual sale or licensing of vintage recordings. Which was an accurate description of what serious collectors did, often informally, and what he intended to do somewhat more formally. The LLC structure meant the collection was no longer personal property in the simple sense. It was a business asset, which created a layer of documentation and formality that made casual appropriation significantly more difficult and casual dismissal significantly harder. His mother could not hand Richard a spreadsheet and frame the LLC's asset as family property eligible for liquidation. That framing required a legal argument, which required cost and time and visibility, all of which were disincentives. He named the LLC Meridian Sound Archive, LLC. He chose that name because his grandfather had once used the word meridian when describing the moment of clarity that came from really listening to a well-recorded piece of music, the point where everything aligns. Boss, he had said, the thing you are always approaching. Formation cost $312 plus Adler's fees. He filed online, paid the state fee from his savings, received the confirmation within 10 days. He opened a business checking account with a $50 deposit. He transferred the authentication certificate, the inventory, and the formal bequest documentation into the LLC's records file, which he stored digitally with 2 backups and physically in the safe deposit box. As the collection was now, formally, an asset of Meridian Sound Archive, LLC, and he was the sole member. He told his mother about the LLC during a conversation in the kitchen 2 weeks after the family meeting, not as a confrontation, but as information, delivered with the same neutral tone he used when he was telling her something factual and settled. He showed her the formation documents. He watched her read them. "You don't trust us," she said when she had finished. "Well, I trust you to make decisions in the family's interest as you understand it," Ethan said. "This makes sure the family's interest and the collection's interest are not in conflict." She looked at him with the expression he had seen many times over a lifetime, but was seeing differently now. Not maternal displeasure, not exactly, but the expression of a person encountering a version of someone they thought they knew and recalibrating. He was no longer the person who said okay. The person who said okay was a version of him formed under a specific set of conditions, and those conditions had not fully formed yet, and he did not intend to let them. She said, "Your grandfather would have wanted you to take care of the family." "My grandfather wanted me to take care of the archive," Ethan said. "He was specific about it." She went to her room. He washed his coffee cup and placed it on the drying rack and went to work. In the months that followed, Ethan began doing 2 things in parallel. The first was his regular work, the data management job at the logistics company that he would have until the restructuring, which gave him income and kept his existence unremarkable to those around him. The second was building. He began studying for the Series 65 exam, which is the qualification exam for investment advisors. Not because he intended to become an investment advisor, but because the knowledge it required was the knowledge that had been used against him. Asset valuation, financial structures, the mechanics of how money moved through families and estates and legal entities. He studied on the bus and during his lunch break and in the evenings, in the methodical way he had always studied, moving through the material in sections, building a framework before populating it with detail. He also, very quietly, began learning everything he could about the secondary market for vintage recordings, not as a casual interest, but as professional research. Dealer margins, auction house fee structures, the specific collectors who drove prices at the top of the market, the emerging platforms that were beginning to challenge the traditional auction model, the authentication standards that were becoming more rigorous as values increased. He read everything Gordon Fitch had in his reading area during his second and third visits to Criterion Audio. He talked to Gordon with the specific attention of a student who knows what they want to learn and is managing the pace of revelation carefully, because Gordon was a person who responded to genuine interest but was sensitive to being used. And Ethan had learned the value of genuine interest. He did not tell Gordon about the capital pressing's full value yet. He told Gordon he was interested in understanding the market better. Gordon, who was not unsophisticated about the relationship between information and trust, told him a great deal. The first LP from the collection he sold was not the capital pressing. It was one of the Blue Note pressings, the less valuable of the two, which Gordon assessed at between $7,000 and $9,000, and which Ethan placed, on Gordon's recommendation, at a specialist auction in Chicago in March of that year. A final hammer price, with buyer's premium, $11,400. He deposited the check into the Meridian Sound Archive business account and transferred 80% of it to his personal savings as a business distribution, and paid the appropriate taxes and made the appropriate records. And he had, after taxes, approximately $8,000 that had not existed 3 months ago. He did not tell his family. The second sale was the other Blue Note pressing in June, at a New York auction house that had a stronger collector base for that label's output. Final hammer, $14,200. After taxes and fees, just over $10,000. He now had $19,000 in savings that no one in his family knew about, built from assets that had been assessed at $65 apiece in a bulk lot. He moved out of his childhood bedroom and into a studio apartment in the city. Oh, not the Merchant Street studio of his previous life, but a different one, in a better building, with a window that faced a courtyard rather than a wall. It was $300 a month more than Merchant Street would have been. He could afford it. His mother said very little about the move. She had been recalibrating for months, operating in a different register with him since the family meeting. Not cold exactly, but cautious. Oh, which was a relationship dynamic he found easier to navigate than warmth because it required less performance. She did not ask about the collection or the LLC. His stepfather made a comment at a family dinner about Ethan's grandfather always having been a bit eccentric, and Ethan noted the comment without responding to it and ate his dinner. Diane, to her credit, had never brought up the deposit conflict again. She had found the money through some combination of her own savings, and Ethan eventually learned a short-term loan from Derek's parents, which Derek had apparently been resistant to asking for, but had eventually been persuaded was the appropriate move. She had moved into the Riverside Heights apartment on schedule. She seemed genuinely happy there, or happy in the way that people are happy when their immediate problem has been solved, which is a real variety of happiness, even if it is not the sustainable kind. Ethan had no particular animus toward Diane. She had been a passive actor in a family meeting whose agenda had been set by their parents. He did not forgive her for her passivity, but he understood it, because he had spent most of his first life being passive in the same family and had understood what it cost. The Series 65 study took him 8 months. He passed the exam on his first attempt in October, and the qualification sat in his records unused for the moment, a door he had built but not yet chosen to walk through. Beyond, he was now 23 years old, and he had a formally structured LLC with a documented asset base of approximately $60,000 to $80,000 in remaining collection value, a business account, a professional qualification, and $19,000 in personal savings. He was making $51,000 at the logistics company and spending carefully. He also had something else, a very clear picture of what was coming. Richard's investments were in 3 vehicles, 2 of which Ethan remembered from hearing about them in fragments during family conversations, one of which he had researched more carefully once he had the financial education to understand what he was looking at. One of the vehicles was a private equity fund that had performed adequately in the years before his first life and would begin performing poorly within 18 months, as the sector it was concentrated in entered a correction. He could not tell Richard this without revealing things he should not know, but he did not need to tell Richard. He only needed to be positioned correctly when it happened. The logistics company restructuring was 18 months away approximately. He knew it was coming, and he knew what it would do to his role, and he began positioning himself for the move it would create. He had a colleague named James Holt who had moved into a technology consulting role the previous year and was doing well, and Ethan had kept that relationship carefully. He began asking James the right questions, about the skill set the consulting work required, about the gaps in the market, about the specific clients James was doing best with. Not telegraphing, just learning. He also began his real research on the capital pressing. He had made no decision about when to sell it. He had not made that decision because it was the largest decision in the structure, and the timing of it would determine everything else. He knew the London hammer price had been $77,000 in 2022, but he was not living toward 2022 in a straight line deal anymore. He was living toward the most favorable moment, and the most favorable moment was not just about the market value, but about the totality of his position when the sale occurred. He wanted to be established. He wanted to be past the period where the proceeds would simply be absorbed by immediate needs. He wanted to sell from strength rather than necessity. That discipline, the discipline of waiting to sell from strength, was perhaps the central lesson of his first life. He had not had it. The collection had been sold in necessity, under pressure, for nothing, and the deficit had defined everything that came after. He was not going to repeat that pattern in any domain. He began attending specialist record fairs, not to buy initially, just to watch. And he stood at tables and looked at what people brought and how they priced it, and how buyers assessed condition, and what conversations happened between serious collectors. He asked careful questions. He began, slowly, to be recognized as a knowledgeable presence in a space that rewards knowledge and is attentive to who has it. At a fair in March, he met a dealer named Rosa Albright, who ran a specialist stall focused entirely on original pressings from the period 1960 to 1975, which was the period his grandfather had cared most about. She was 58 and precise, and had an extraordinary eye for condition grading, better than anyone he had seen. They talked for a long time at her table about provenance documentation and the changing authentication standards, and she offered him a business card and said if he ever wanted to bring anything in for evaluation, her fees were reasonable and her waiting list was shorter than Gordon Fitch's. Yet he called her the following week. Over the next 6 months, Rosa Albright became the third leg of the structure he was building. She knew the market in ways that were complementary to Gordon's knowledge. Where Gordon had depth in the broader collectibles space, Rosa had an almost forensic understanding of this specific period and its specific buyers. She knew which auction houses had the right buyer networks for the material in the collection. Well, she knew which private collectors were active and what they were looking for. She knew specifically about the capital pressings market because it was the kind of piece that serious people in the serious end of this world talked about. There are 4 other confirmed first state copies in private hands that I know of, she told him one afternoon in her shop on a side street in the Arts District, surrounded by record sleeves and the smell of paper. 2 I've handled personally over the years. Well, 1 sold through Christie's. 1 was sold privately about 8 years ago and I've lost track of it. The London sale was the 4th. And mine would be the 5th, Ethan said. She looked at him with the careful attention she brought to all things. You're not in a hurry. No. Good. She set down her coffee. The people who got the best prices for this type of material got them because they waited for the right buyer rather than the right market condition. Because the right market condition and the right buyer don't always align. When they do, the premium can be significant. He was beginning to understand what significant looked like in practice. He had been building the knowledge base for over a year, and he was starting to see the internal logic of how serious collector markets worked. They were relational before they were financial, which meant the prices achieved by those with relationships and knowledge consistently exceeded those achieved by sellers who simply listed something and waited for a result. He was not simply waiting for the market to move. He was building a position in the network. It was in October, 14 months after the family meeting, that Richard's first investment vehicle began its correction. He heard about it the way he heard about most family financial developments, in pieces. Through his mother's voice on the phone, the specific compression of tone that she deployed when discussing financial problems, which had a quality of carefully managed disclosure, information released in controlled quantities because she was not yet certain of the landscape. He listened. He asked quiet questions. He offered nothing. 3 months later, the second vehicle followed. Richard had been in 2 similar funds, different firms but similar underlying exposure, and the sector correction hit both of them in the same 6-month window. Ethan heard about the second one at Christmas dinner from his stepfather directly. because Richard had had enough wine to become confessional about things he would not normally discuss at table. The loss was not catastrophic. It was the kind of loss that is more dangerous than catastrophic because it does not trigger emergency response protocols. It just becomes a slow bleeding of the financial position, the kind that gets managed with additional debt and deferred maintenance until the deferred maintenance becomes an emergency. He drove home from Christmas dinner and sat in his apartment and thought about the house. His mother's house was a 4-bedroom colonial in Westfield Heights, purchased in 2001 for $218,000. And now worth, in the first life version of this sequence, approximately $440,000 when the rezoning came through, was then subject to a complicated 3-year period of assessment and appeal before settling at around $390,000 in practical market terms. The mortgage had been refinanced twice. The current balance was around $160,000. The equity position was, on paper, significant, but the house was also the collateral on several of Richard's financial arrangements. And when those arrangements became strained, the house became the structural vulnerability. He knew what would happen. He had seen it happen, from the outside in his first life, at a distance, because by the time the family's financial situation became a genuine crisis, he had already been drained of resources and distanced enough that his involvement was limited to receiving phone calls he could not afford to answer with money. He was not going to be in that position again. He was also not going to save them. He wanted to be precise about this. Because it was easy to dress protective self-interest as familial obligation, and he was not willing to do that. His refusal to be drained was not rescue of himself in order to rescue them later. His refusal was simply his refusal. What happened to them as a consequence of their own choices was their consequence. But there was a specific piece of the sequence that required his attention, and it was not about them. Since it was about the house as a vehicle for a particular piece of his own financial architecture. The zoning change would happen in approximately 18 months. When it happened, the neighborhood's commercial development potential would briefly make certain properties attractive. Acquisition targets for a specific class of investor, developers who moved quickly before the assessment appeals settled the new commercial zoning's practical implications. There was a window, approximately 8 months, sits between the zoning announcement and the stabilization of the new value assessments, during which properties in the affected blocks would receive above-market offers from developers who were pricing in the commercial potential but not yet paying the fully stabilized price. He knew his mother and Richard would not understand this window. In his first life, they had not understood it, and the developer offer they had eventually received after the assessment stabilization, mine had been for $380,000, which was above market for residential purposes, but below what they could have gotten in the window. They had held out through the window waiting for the real number, which was a common mistake made by people whose relationship to asset values is emotional rather than analytical. He did not intend to steer his mother and Richard toward the correct decision. He intended to be in a position where his own assets were unentangled from their decision-making, which was the position he was currently building, and where he had the liquidity to make his own moves when the window opened, which was the position he needed to be building faster. He sold a 4th record from the collection in February, an original pressing, different label, different era, as that Rosa Albright had identified as being in the upper tier of its category and had placed with a specialist buyer in Tokyo through a private sale arrangement. Final price, $18,300. After fees and taxes, just under $13,000. His savings were now at $32,000. The Meridian Sound Archive business account held an additional $14,000 in retained earnings. He left the logistics company in April, 18 months after the rebirth, when the restructuring created a severance package for voluntary departures that was generous enough to be worth taking, and which gave him 3 months of runway, a non-compete that was narrow enough to work around, and a reference that acknowledged his years of precise, useful work. He moved into a contract consulting arrangement with 3 companies, including James Holt's network, doing data and analytics work that paid significantly more per hour than his salary had and required fewer hours to achieve a comparable income, which freed the remaining hours for the record business and for studying. He was now studying real estate fundamentals, not for investment purposes per se, but for the specific purpose of understanding the zoning cycle he was navigating. He took an online course and read 3 textbooks and talked to a commercial real estate broker he had met at a Chamber of Commerce event that Marcus had dragged him to, a woman named Linda Vance, who was in the middle of a long career and had seen several neighborhood transformation cycles and was generous with her knowledge in the way that experienced practitioners sometimes are with people who ask the right questions. "The window you're describing," Linda said, over coffee in her office, yet which had the crowded, purposeful look of a person who moved too much information to organize it elegantly, "is real. Developers know it too. The question is always who moves first." "What creates the delay on the seller side?" Ethan said. "Attachment, information deficit, the combination of not knowing what the moment is worth and not wanting to leave the thing that the moment is attached to." She refilled her coffee. "You residential owners in commercial rezoning situations are the hardest sellers because the property is not just an asset to them. It's their home. The emotional premium they assign to staying out paces the financial premium they could receive by leaving." Ethan thought about his mother's colonial in Westfield Heights, purchased in 2001, decorated with accumulated family objects, the site of family dinners and holidays and arguments, and all the textured sediment of a domestic life. And he thought about what it would take for his mother to sell it during the 8-month window after the zoning announcement. Nothing he did, probably. But that was not his problem. His problem was his own position, and his position was increasingly strong. He passed the Series 65 licensing exam, activated the qualification through registration with the state, and formed a second entity, an investment advisory practice, sole proprietorship initially, operating under the Meridian Sound Archive umbrella for accounting purposes. He did not solicit clients, not yet. He used the entity for structuring his own investment decisions, which were still modest in scale, but were now systematically organized in a way that created documentation of a coherent strategy, the kind of documentation that would be useful later. The capital pressing was still in the collection. He had now been back for 22 months. He was 24 years old, had $32,000 in personal savings, $14,000 in business retained earnings, a functioning LLC structure with an asset base of approximately $50,000 in remaining collection value, a professional qualification, 2 consulting contracts, a network in the specialist record market, and a clear picture of the landscape for the next 36 months. He had also, somewhat to his own surprise, rebuilt a relationship with Marcus Webb that was different from the friendship of his first life, more candid, more mutual. Marcus was good at things Ethan was not, specifically the social intelligence required for navigating the collector network, the way he could talk to anyone about music in a way that made them feel their own enthusiasm was intelligent rather than provincial, which was a talent that opened doors. Ethan was good at things Marcus was not. The financial and legal architecture, the pattern recognition, the discipline. They had started going to record fairs together and had done 2 small joint acquisitions, buying, cleaning, and reselling pieces that were undervalued at the intake price. The returns were modest, but the practice was valuable. Marcus knew some of what Ethan was doing. He did not know all of it. He knew about the LLC and the collection's value and the general strategic intent, all which Marcus had received with the equanimity of a person who has always suspected his friend was operating more carefully than he let on. He did not know about the capital pressing's full significance or about Ethan's specific knowledge of the future, which Ethan had never found a way to explain that did not require him to sound like a person who should be discussed with a mental health professional. He was 24 when the zoning announcement came, in August, and 8 months ahead of the schedule he had internalized, which was a reminder that maps are not certainties and that being early is only a problem if you are not paying attention. He was paying attention. He called Linda Vance the morning the zoning announcement appeared in the City Planning Commission's public record, before it appeared in any of the 3 local news outlets that covered development, because Linda followed the Planning Commission's records directly and had told him when to look. "Well, there it is," she said, and he could hear the particular satisfaction of someone who has predicted something correctly. "How long before the developer offers start coming in?" 60 to 90 days. The sophisticated ones are already aware, probably. You'll see letters in mailboxes within 6 weeks. His mother received her first developer letter in 5 weeks. She called him to describe it in a tone that was halfway between alarm and flattery. Or it's because the letter was from a development company whose logo was professional and whose offer letter was written in the language of opportunity rather than acquisition. She read him the number. He looked at the ceiling of his apartment. The number was the upper edge of the window price range, $360,000. Given the outstanding mortgage balance and the entanglement with Richard's various debt instruments, the net proceeds would be meaningful. Not enough to resolve everything, but enough to reset. "What do you think?" his mother asked. He recognized the question for what it was, not a genuine request for advice, but a request for permission to think about it, which was a different kind of request and required a different kind of answer. "I think you should take it to a real estate attorney before you respond," Ethan said. "Not Richard's people, someone outside. And I think you should understand what the window is." He explained the window. He explained it in the language of Linda Vance's framework, not his own foreknowledge, which was not a lie exactly, but was an arrangement of truth that was sustainable. He explained the difference between window price and stabilized price, and what the developer's speed in sending the letter implied about the quality of the opportunity. His mother was silent for a moment. Then she said, "You learned all this recently?" "Over the last year, yes." Another pause. "You're very different than you used to be." "I'm the same," Ethan said. "I just know more." She sold the house in October for $355,000 after a counter-negotiation that the real estate attorney she hired, on Ethan's recommendation, conducted properly. The timing was good. The proceeds after mortgage payoff and debt resolution left his mother and Richard with enough to reset to a clean financial position. No debt, modest savings. A rental apartment in a different neighborhood, and a marriage that would, Ethan suspected, not survive the displacement from the house that had been its structural anchor, though that was not something he needed to either predict or manage. He was not a character in the drama of what his mother and Richard did with their fresh start. He was a person with his own trajectory, and the significance of the house sale for his trajectory was simply that it removed the entanglement. He was not going to be the person called when the financial pressure mounted. The pressure had been released by the sale, and if it remounted later, it would do so in a context where the collection was long gone from the conversation. He was 25 when he sold the Capital Pressing. He had spent a year building toward the sale with Rosa Albright, who had by this point become something between a business partner and a mentor in the specific way of people whose professional competencies complement each other so completely that collaboration generates more value than either could create alone. They had identified a buyer, not through auction, but through Rosa's network, at a private collector in Switzerland who had been looking for a first-day copy for years and whose agent had reached out to Rosa directly after hearing through the network that a copy of exceptional provenance and condition might be available. The provenance documentation Ethan had built from the beginning proved its value in the negotiation. The chain from his grandfather's 1988 estate sale acquisition to the current owner was complete, documented, and corroborated. The authentication certificate was supported by a second independent assessment that Rosa had commissioned through a third party. The condition was confirmed at near mint, which was remarkable for a copy of this age, and which justified the premium position at the upper end of the value range. The negotiation took 3 weeks. Ethan let Rosa lead it, because Rosa understood the collector dynamic, and the Swiss buyer's agent understood that Rosa was the kind of person whose assessment was final and trustworthy, which was a reputational asset worth more in this context than anything Ethan could have built independently at 25. He was present for the key conversations, but deliberately quiet, the specific silence of a person who knows when the talking is being done correctly by someone else. Final price, $71,500. He had not achieved the 2022 London price. He was not in 2022. He was 5 years before that, and the price achieved was the highest private sale price ever recorded for a copy of this pressing at that point in time, which Rosa confirmed with the satisfaction of someone who has correctly assessed a market and executed against that assessment. After Rosa's commission and applicable taxes, he received $58,900. He sat in his apartment that evening with the wire transfer confirmation on his screen, and he thought about a January morning 7 years ago and 2 crates in the trunk of a car and Derek Whitmore's hands with no care for pressure points. He thought about $230. He thought about the teenager at Hayward's used media who had found 4 records he liked personally and bumped the offer up slightly out of genuine, if minor, enthusiasm. Oh, he did not feel triumph in the way triumph is usually described. He felt something more structural than triumph, the particular sensation of a person who has rebuilt something that was taken from them, not by recovering what was taken, but by building it back better, which is a different thing and requires a different relationship with the loss. The loss was still real. It had happened in his memory, and it had shaped a decade of his life. And the record that had sold for $71.5 today had sold for $210 to a buyer in North Carolina who had probably sold it on for $600, and the whole chain of diminishment was real and had happened. But it had happened in a life that was not this one. He transferred the proceeds to the Meridian Sound Archive account, allocated the tax reserve, went and moved the remainder into the personal investment portfolio he had been building for 18 months. A portfolio that was modest in scale, but coherently structured, weighted toward the sectors he knew would perform over the next several years, managed with the discipline of someone who has learned that the worst financial decisions are made from necessity and the best ones are made from patience. He called Marcus. "Did it close?" Marcus asked. "It closed." Silence on the line for a moment. "Hey, then, what's the number?" 71.5. A longer silence. He could hear Marcus breathing, and then the sound of Marcus sitting down on something, the quality of movement in the background. "That's your grandfather's record." "Yes." "He paid how much for it in 1988? $40, maybe $35. He said he went back and forth in the parking lot of the estate sale and eventually decided 40 was fair. He knew what it was," Marcus said. "He always knew what it was. He just didn't have any use for the money. And Hayward's put it online for 65. 65? Yes." Another pause. Marcus said, "They made you carry it out in a crate." It was not a question. It was not said with heat, either. Marcus said it the way you say a fact that is so complete in itself that it requires no elaboration. The flatness of it was the truest thing in the conversation. "Yes," Ethan said. "They made me carry it out in a crate." He was 25 years old. Told he had the cleanest financial position of his life, built from his own labor and knowledge and patience, and from a specific piece of professional expertise that had been forged, unwillingly, by the experience of watching a family mistake destroy something irreplaceable. He had an LLC with remaining assets, a consulting practice, an investment qualification, a network, and savings that had never existed in his first life. He had also, in the 2 years since the family meeting, I quietly learned enough about estate law and financial forensics to understand precisely what had been done to him the first time, not just by his family's casual appropriation, but by the structural conditions that had made it possible. He had assembled this knowledge not as a grievance, but as professional literacy, the way a doctor learns pathology, to understand how damage happens in order to prevent it. He knew the financial situation of his family in granular detail, because the combination of his memory of their trajectory and his subsequent professional education allowed him to read the signals that came through normal family contact with something approaching actuarial precision. He knew Richard's remaining investment positions. He knew the approximate state of their new rental apartment arrangement. He knew Diane and Derek had gotten engaged and that Derek's commercial real estate work was entering a period of difficulty as the leasing market tightened. He was not watching any of this in order to intervene. He was watching it in order to be clear about the shape of the requests that would come, because the requests would come and he intended to be prepared for them. The first one came from his mother in November, 8 months after the capital pressing sale. It arrived as a phone call, and it was framed in the way that all such calls were framed, as an inquiry rather than a request. How were things going? What was he working on? Oh, was he still doing the consulting work? Just checking in? He answered all of it honestly and with warmth, because he was not in a posture of hostility and had no interest in being. He genuinely loved his mother, in the complicated, load-bearing way that you love someone whose limitations have shaped your own. He wished her well. He wanted her to be okay. These things were true. He also said, before she could reach the actual subject, "Is there something specific you're thinking about?" She paused. Then, "Richard and I have been talking about some options. There are some things we're trying to work through. I don't want to burden you." "You're not burdening me," Ethan said. but I want to be honest about what I can and can't help with. I can be a resource for information, and I can point you toward good people. No, I'm not in a position to contribute financially right now." He paused to let that land. "But I know some people who might be useful, depending on what you're working through." She described the situation. He listened. He identified the problem. Richard had invested in a third vehicle, after the first two had underperformed, in the classic pattern of the loss-chasing investor, and the third was underperforming worse than the first two. The shortfall was not catastrophic, but it was real. They were looking at ways to reorganize. He recommended a fee-only financial advisor, a specific person whose name he had kept in reserve for this conversation. Not a commissioned advisor, not someone who would sell product, but a fee-only professional who would look at the actual situation and give an actual assessment. He gave her the name and the phone number, and he said, "Go to this person before you make any other decisions. It will cost $300 for an initial session." It is worth $300, she said she would. She thanked him with the specific inflection of someone who has been surprised by the shape of the help offered, which was not money, but was something more useful than money. He hung up and made tea and sat with it in his apartment and thought about what his grandfather had once said about records. The value is in knowing what you have. Everything else follows from that. He had known what he had the second time. Everything else had followed. As the LLC continued, he sold 3 more records from the collection over the following 18 months, all at prices that validated the original assessment and some above it. As the market continued its long upward trajectory, he kept the original Blue Note pressing that Gordon Fitch had assessed first, the one his grandfather had annotated in the crate with a small handwritten card that said simply, "James Cole, acquired 1977, good listening." And he kept it because some things are not for sale, and because he had learned with some difficulty to tell the difference between things you keep and things you build with. He built a research practice, eventually, around authentication and valuation work for the specialist market, drawing on the knowledge base he had accumulated and the network he had built and the professional credibility that came from executing several significant transactions cleanly and without drama. And he was 27 when he formalized the practice alongside the LLC. He was 30 when it was his primary income and had outgrown the consulting work that had started it. He was in a city 2 hours from his childhood home. He was in a different life, which was also the same life, which was the thing about second chances that the stories never accurately captured. It was not a replacement. It was a correction, and the original wound was still in the memory. And the original record had still been carried out to a car on a gray January morning by a person who had not yet learned to say no, and nothing that came after erased that. What came after was simply what came after, the result of a person applying everything that had been learned at cost, applied as precisely as possible to the conditions they had been given. He was at a record fair in March, the same fair where he had met Rosa Albright years ago, standing at a table with a coffee going cold beside him and a crate of mid-period pressings that a dealer had brought in for consignment, when his phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. The message contained a link and 3 words. Look at this. The link was to a specialist auction result finalized that morning. A First State Capital pressing, confirmed in the announcement as one of a small number of known copies, condition assessed at very good, house with provenance documentation from a collection in North Carolina. Final hammer price, $89,000. Ethan looked at the price for a moment. He thought about the buyer in North Carolina who had paid $210 at Hayward's Used Media in 2013 and had held the record for 12 years and had now achieved $89,000. Good for them, he thought, and he was surprised to find that he meant it. Because the person who had sat in a dark studio apartment in the fall of a bad year and felt the full weight of what had been taken from him was also a person who could, from this distance and this altitude, recognize that other people's good fortune was simply other people's good fortune and did not diminish his own. He typed back, "Mine closed at 71.5 in 2020. Marcus's response came in 30 seconds. Still, yeah. Ethan typed, still. He put his phone in his pocket and looked at the crate of pressings and picked up the first one, reading the matrix code from the edge without removing it from the sleeve the way his grandfather had taught him, and he thought, good. He set it back and moved to the next one.